Well, hello, friends, and thank you for joining me on this Tuesday edition of the Daily Connection. It's a time when we get together in the Word, and more importantly, Word gets into us. So we're still going through this whole idea of what does love look like, and today's really going to be important for that because what Jesus insists upon regarding whether we remain in His love or not. So look with me in John 15, verse 10, where He says, "If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in His love." Now, obviously, that idea of remaining is important because he ended verse 9 by saying, "Remain in my love." Now, in verse 10, he says, "Here is an essential aspect, an element." I hate to call it an element, maybe aspect is better, but here's an essential element of remaining in my love. It's crucial, it's absolutely necessary. And of course, the idea of remain is kind of a more intimate term of being make yourself at home. And so how do we do that? How do we make ourselves at home in God's love? Well, one way we do that, he says, is by keeping my commands. And it's important to understand that keeping the commands in this case is not motivated by a consequence, a fear of consequence. I think sometimes when we hear the word keep and command together, the command can sometimes carry a negative connotation, which it shouldn't. Because really that all depends on what the command is as to far whether it's a negative, hey, avoid this, or positive, hey, do this. In this case, the word command doesn't have either. It's more neutral, and it's more rooted in the fact of he's saying the instruction I've given you, the pattern I presented you, all of that, you're to keep my commands. And if you do that, you will remain in my love. And that's not the first time that Jesus said this. Actually, if we go back to John chapter 14, first of all, in verse 15, he says, "If you love me, you will keep my commands." So he says that love, true, genuine love for our Lord, is demonstrated by by obedience to the commands. He comes back again in verse 21 of chapter 14. "The one who has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me." And of course, he says, "The one who loves me will be loved by my Father." So there we see again that obedience is a demonstration that we have truly experienced the love of God, and we are now in a position where we can then demonstrate back to Him that same love. And so I want to come back to that idea again, that it's not it's not an obedience that's rooted in a fear of consequence. Instead, it's a love that is motivated by a desire to please. And even more than that, why would it be so important to keep the commands and that be a reflection of love and that be a requirement for love? Well, simple. If you look at the commandments, we see that the commandments are set up to guide us in the proper understanding and application of love. Because think about today, so many things are conveyed and tried to communicate it through the language of love, the word love. Oh, I love that, or we kind of throw it out there flippantly. And so if there's not a guide, if there are not some stipulations attached, then love becomes frivolous and it becomes very thin. Jesus, our Lord, gave us guidelines. He gave us the commands so that we would love Him appropriately. We would love Him properly as one who is holy and pure should demand of those that are going to love Him. Basically what He's saying is, if you're going to truly love me, you got to love me on my conditions. You got to love me on my stipulations. You got to love me according to my standards. And that's where that obedience comes in. He presented those standards, He presented those guidelines in His commands so that we would love Him properly, so that we would love Him appropriately. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming days. But I just want us to see, first of all, that this love He's conveying, or the obedience that He's demanding as a demonstration of that love and as a requirement to remain in that love, it's not an obedience that's rooted in fear of consequence. And of course, I love what 1 John 5:3 says about this. "For this is what love for God is, to keep His commands, and His commands are not a burden." So here we see that the commands are not a burden, and the commands are not put in place just to weigh us down. Instead, they are guidelines to lead us to the proper love for God, and of course later on, the proper love for one another. Well, I hope this is encouraging for you. I hope it's insightful for you today. Maybe it'll cause you to reflect on how you go about loving God, and am I loving God according to His Word? You may want to go to some of the texts back in the book of Exodus, where God first presents the commandments. Those 10 core commands that later on he elaborates on were essential for the proper love of Him and our love for one another. So maybe go back and read through those and just see how they set up those guidelines and set up those parameters for how true love looks in a relationship to Him. Well, speaking of love, I love you, Faith Family. I love being your pastor. I love that you commit time every day to being in the Word, because when we get in the Word every day, that means the Word is going to get into us. And the more the Word comes into us, our minds we are transformed by the renewing of our minds, and we are commissioned fresh and new every day to go out and live sent.